Welcome back. South African banks are in hot water yet again following allegations that they helped an international syndicate out in Zimbabwe basically to smuggle gold and launder billions of dollars. This was all detailed in an investigation by the Al Jazeera Investigative Journalism Unit. Our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, has been looking at both the reaction and what was contained in that interview. Xolani, where does it leave us?
Well, that is a different story altogether, the Al Jazeera one. Today, we know that South African banks are alleged to have been in cahoots to launder money in that gold smuggling operation. Well, now the Competition Tribunal has just announced that it has turned down the appeals by 28 local and international banks, and that these banks all have cases, in fact, to answer for the allegations that they manipulated the rand in a fraudulent scheme and in cahoots among each other between 2007 and 2013. These banks operating in various countries and jurisdictions in Europe, South Africa, Australia and United States conspired through information sharing on electronic and other platforms when they were trading in the dollar and the rand currency pair. Roy Havemann is with Intellidex, and he joins us now on this breaking news story. Roy, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. The history of these allegations as to when these 28 banks are alleged to have manipulated the rand. Take us back a little bit to what exactly is we're talking about here when it comes to the rand or currency manipulation that has brought us here to the Competition Tribunal, clearly saying that the banks have a case to answer here.
Yeah, good afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. It all goes back to a scandal in 2013 in the United Kingdom and in the United States, where there was a finding that a number of banks had colluded for over a decade to manipulate the exchange rates in the forex markets. And a number of regulators throughout the world did an investigation into the forex markets, and then they instituted proceedings overseas against a number of the big banks overseas. And if you go back into history, and I remember reading the transcripts of the chats that these foreign exchange dealers were doing in London, talking about how they call themselves the cartel or the mafia, and they were a bunch of very influential traders in London. And what they were doing was chatting to each other before they put trades into the system. And that was found to be a case of clear market manipulation. And the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom imposed fines of about 1.7 billion on 5 banks because they didn't have proper procedures in place to control these behaviors. And as a consequence of that, obviously, our Competition Commission also instituted an investigation. And then in 2017, they brought out they laid a charge, essentially, at the Competition Tribunal, where they indicated that there was a case to be found against South African banks.
So Roy, sorry to come in there. So basically, they were acting in cahoots with each other, and there has been. This is quite a complicated story in terms of how exactly they actually did this, and many banks have said that these people, their employees, acted individually. This was not something that was a huge scheme, but as you've just alluded now, millions of rands were paid to competition authorities in foreign countries. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, it's very important to highlight that those were fines levied on banks in London, not our banks. Because the foreign exchange market, there are only a few very big players that are involved in the foreign exchange market. And they sort of control all the flows in the market. There are obviously two sides to every story. The South African banks will say that they have very little ability to intervene in the markets and manipulate the markets because they're quite small players. in the global situation. In 2017, the Competition Commission said no, they think that South African banks were able to manipulate the rand. The tribunal at the time felt that there were some holes in the case that was brought to them, one of them relating to jurisdiction, and the evidence hasn't really yet been seen by everyone. So I think it's a little bit too early to conclude that the South African banks have been manipulating the exchange. I think we'll have to see how this case unfolds.
One of the interesting things about these allegations is that the banks, what they've done is not really because of the share value of the rand itself, but the share value of the banks and not the rand exchange rate itself that was at play here. It's quite a complicated story, as you said. There isn't enough information about it, but many people have said that the fact that this could happen is because there was lacking, a lot of lacks in terms of regulations and policies to ensure that this does not happen. It seems like the banks, Investex, FNB, your ABSA and others here in South Africa, it seems like the Competition Tribunal is saying that since you have a case to answer, it suggests that our policies, our regulatory framework was up for manipulation as well, since they could do this under our noses. Would I be right to see it that way?
Yeah, I think at the time we also had a slightly stricter system of particularly regulating the foreign exchange market with the system of exchange controls. Whether or not that helped reduce the likelihood of manipulation, I'm not sure. But certainly what has happened subsequent to the international case, that early case that I spoke about, is that the regulators have imposed much stricter rules on banks in terms of how they trade foreign exchange. So, for example, now all the chats are recorded, and indeed that's how they discovered this, was that all the chats that these traders were having with one another overseas had been recorded. And so it was actually very easy for the regulators to pick up the problems. And so in many ways, the regulators have actually acted to stamp out the abuse.
And that, Roy, is, of course, in the UK. Here at home, the Competition Tribunal, the significance of this particular ruling, while we are still at the beginning stages, what does it say about this particular case of the allegations themselves, and not even getting into the merits of the case itself?
Yes, well, I mean, the banks have argued that they haven't seen the details of the investigation, and so it's been very difficult for anyone to evaluate what the merits are. There's a very interesting jurisdictional problem because foreign exchange is traded obviously cross-border, almost by definition. What happens is there are different players in the system. There are local banks, there are offshore banks, and then there are banks that operate both locally and offshore. And this was one of the big issues in the last time that this came to the Competition Tribunal, was whether or not the South African authorities have jurisdiction over things that happen in London. Obviously, the banks would argue that they don't, but the South African regulators would argue that they do. And this has been one of the big issues that has drawn out the case in quite a lot of, over a long period of time.
Let's talk about the implications, Roy, of currency manipulation, particularly in this case. If it did, in fact, take place, what was the end goal? Obviously, many people would think the end goal is to rake in a lot of money. What was the end goal here? And are there any implications on the value of the rand itself in terms of the exchange rate? Or is it something else that these manipulators, if indeed they were there, they were after?
So I think what the currency manipulators were after was to make profit. Particularly when there were very large trades that were going to happen. So sometimes there is a big transaction, and then if the trader knows that this transaction is going to happen, and he knows in advance what the price is going to be, and he can manipulate the price in advance, then he can make a big profit on the trade. And it's not always that it means that the rand will be stronger or weaker, but it would just mean that the rand is not at the level it would have been if there was no manipulation. In some cases, in this international scandal, they created a stronger currency, and in some cases they created a weaker currency. But the way they made their profits is that they knew in advance what the price would be at which the currency traded. So it's quite difficult to work out if there would have been a change in the overall value of the currency, I think.
So it's not really, when it comes to the rand-dollar exchange rate, where there would have been, the impact would have been felt, but it was all to rake in profits. Are we likely, if indeed this did take place and they are found guilty eventually, all these banks, particularly South African banks, are we likely to see similar fines being imposed here at home? Because that's what the competition authorities are here to do, to make sure that the playing field is level in the South African economy.
Yes, definitely. So there are definitely fining provisions in the Competitions Act, and so the authorities can fine South African banks if they're found to have been colluding, and obviously they should fine them as much as possible, or relative to the impact on the markets. And so we'll have to see how this case turns out. I mean, I think today is a big move forward on something that's been around for a very long period of time. So yeah, we'll see how it all pans out.
Roy Havemann is with Intellidex here at home, talking to us about the Competition Tribunal's ruling. Thank you very much for your time, Roy. Of course, the Competition Tribunal, for the second time now, saying that banks have a case to answer on the allegations of currency manipulation, which took place allegedly between 2007 and 2013. It's going to be an interesting case to watch because all the major banks in South Africa, including Barclays and Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan and others, are part of the 28 banks that are mentioned and named as having a case to answer in the rand manipulation allegations. On that note, it's time to take a look at how the JSE is performing at this hour.